Summer 1683. The roads of Hungary turned black with marching men. Not hundreds, not thousands. 150,000 soldiers moved westward in columns so long that scouts at the front made camp before the rearguard had broken theirs. Horses, cannons, supply wagons, and siege equipment stretched across the landscape like a serpent awakening from centuries of hunger. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha commanded this host. He was not merely a general. He was the right hand of Sultan Mehmed IV, answerable only to the throne itself. His reputation had been carved into the flesh of conquered nations. Cities that surrendered received mercy. Cities that resisted became ash and memory. Now his eyes fixed upon a single prize. Vienna. The Habsburgs called it their jewel, the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor, the gateway between East and West. For generations, Ottoman strategists had dreamed of claiming it. Suleiman the Magnificent had tried in 1529 and failed. That failure haunted the empire like an unpaid debt. Kara Mustafa intended to settle that debt forever. The implications rippled across every European court. If Vienna crumbled, the German principalities lay exposed. If the German principalities fell, France would stand alone. If France fell, the continent belonged to the Sultan. Yet Europe watched this approaching catastrophe with something worse than fear: indifference. The Holy Roman Empire existed mostly on paper, a patchwork of jealous territories that agreed on nothing except their mutual suspicion. Emperor Leopold I had already abandoned his own capital, fleeing west with his court while his subjects prepared to die. France, under Louis XIV, secretly hoped Austria would bleed. A weakened rival served French interests better than a grateful ally. Protestant nations nursed old wounds from religious wars and felt little obligation to save Catholic Vienna. The continent that had once united against common threats now fractured into 1,000 competing interests. Only one ruler saw the abyss opening beneath Christian civilization. His name was Jan Sobieski, King of Poland. At 60 years old, Jan Sobieski had earned every grey hair in his beard. He had first ridden to war as a teenager. He had fought Cossacks, Swedes, Tatars, and Turks across 4 decades of nearly continuous conflict. But his body carried the map of those campaigns in scars and old wounds that ached when rain approached. Lesser men would have retreated to comfortable retirement. Sobieski was not a lesser man. When word reached Warsaw that Vienna faced destruction, his counselors urged caution. Poland had its own problems. The treasury echoed with emptiness. The army numbered barely 20,000. The nobility squabbled over petty disputes while peasants starved in villages ravaged by years of war. Sending the king himself on a desperate rescue mission seemed like madness. Sobieski listened to these arguments. Then he wrote a letter to his beloved wife, Maria Casimir. "I ride to save Vienna. If God wills that I should perish there, tell our children their father answered when duty called. Some things matter more than a man's life." He assembled every soldier Poland could spare, every noble who could ride and swing a saber, every peasant who could carry a pike. He emptied garrison towns. He summoned retired veterans from their farms. He gathered 3,000 of the Winged Hussars, the legendary heavy cavalry that had become the most feared fighting force in Eastern Europe. Then he began marching south. 500 miles of mountain passes, river crossings, and summer storms lay between Warsaw and Vienna. Military experts calculated such a journey would take 8 weeks minimum. Sobieski covered it in 15 days. His men slept in their saddles. They ate while riding. They pushed through Carpathian passes where mudslides had obliterated the trails. They forded rivers swollen with rainfall. Or horses died from exhaustion and were replaced from local villages. Men collapsed and were left behind with orders to follow when able. Nothing stopped them. Because somewhere ahead, 15,000 defenders were dying by inches. And Jan Sobieski had made a promise. Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg had not slept in 3 days. The military governor of Vienna stood on the remnants of the Berg bastion and surveyed the devastation. 60 days of siege had transformed his city into a wound. Ottoman cannons had pounded the walls until medieval stone meant to resist swords crumbled like stale bread. Sappers had tunneled beneath the fortifications and detonated mines that opened breaches wide enough to march companies through. And his original garrison of 15,000 had shrunk to 4,000 combat-effective men. Disease claimed as many as enemy action. Dysentery swept through the crowded streets. Wounds festered in the summer heat. Food had disappeared weeks ago. Water grew scarce as the Ottomans poisoned wells and diverted streams. The civilians suffered worse. Mothers watched children waste away from hunger. Fathers stood guard on walls they knew could not hold. Old men who remembered peace wondered if their grandchildren would ever know it. The sound of cannon fire had become so constant that silence now seemed unnatural. And every dawn, Starhemberg climbed the walls and counted the new breaches. 4 major gaps now. The Ottomans had pushed to within yards of the inner defences. One more successful mine, one more determined assault, and the city would fall. Yet Starhemberg refused to negotiate. He had received one message from Kara Mustafa early in the siege: surrender and live, resist and die. The Count had sent back a single word: come. Now, on September 9th, he composed what he believed would be his final dispatch. To any Christian prince who values Christendom, Vienna dies within days. Send aid or send prayers. We require both. A volunteer carried this message through Ottoman lines at midnight, crawling through drainage tunnels and dodging patrols. The messenger reached the Allied camp just as dawn broke over the Vienna woods. Jan Sobieski read the dispatch twice. Then he called his commanders to council. The Allied army had assembled at Tulln, north of Vienna. It was a motley force by any measure. Polish cavalry alongside German infantry, Austrian regulars beside Saxon volunteers, Bavarians who despised Austrians fighting next to Franconians who despised both. Catholic priests offering blessings within earshot of Protestant chaplains leading hymns. Old hatreds simmered beneath the surface. These nations had spent the previous century slaughtering each other over theological disputes. Memories of the 30 Years' War still festered. Trust came hard. Yet something remarkable happened in those final days before battle. The petty grievances that had consumed European politics suddenly seemed pathetically small. Beneath the shadow of Ottoman conquest, the things that united these men outweighed everything that divided them. They spoke different languages and prayed different prayers, but they all understood what waited on the other side of those mountains. Duke Charles of Lorraine commanded the imperial forces, roughly 20,000 Austrians and Germans. He was a capable soldier, respected for his steady competence, if not his brilliance. The German princes had contributed additional thousands, each contingent guarding its independence jealously, but all recognizing the necessity of cooperation. And then there were the Poles. 23,000 had made the impossible march south. They arrived exhausted, their horses gaunt, their supplies depleted. But they arrived, and at their head rode the only king present on the battlefield. Jan Sobieski assumed overall command without debate. His reputation preceded him. More importantly, his presence signified something that titles and treaties could not convey. He had come in person, risking his life and his kingdom when he could have sent subordinates and excuses. That sacrifice purchased authority no amount of politics could match. On the night of September 11th, Sobieski stood atop Kahlenberg Mountain and studied the Ottoman positions below. 80,000 enemy soldiers, hundreds of cannons, cavalry reserves that outnumbered his entire force. The mathematics of warfare suggested retreat. Sobieski had never been skilled at mathematics. "Gentlemen," he announced to his assembled officers, "tomorrow we attack. The hussars will lead the final charge. Make whatever peace your souls require tonight. By this time tomorrow, we will have freed Vienna or died attempting it." No one argued. Dawn arrived grey and cold. A mist clung to the valleys below Kahlenberg. The Ottoman camp stirred slowly, confident in their overwhelming advantage. Kara Mustafa had received reports of the relief force but dismissed them as irrelevant. 27,000 exhausted soldiers against his 80,000 veterans. They would shatter against his lines like waves against a cliff. He ordered a leisurely breakfast and continued planning his victory feast. Meanwhile, on the heights above, the Allied army prepared for what many believed would be their final battle. Infantry formed into columns. Artillery crews loaded their guns. Cavalry units assembled in designated positions, waiting for the order to advance. Across the entire line, men knelt in prayer. Catholic soldiers crossed themselves. Protestants bowed their heads. Polish hussars touched the religious medallions hanging from their necks and whispered the names of wives and children. The Winged Hussars had dressed for battle in full ceremonial armor, steel breastplates polished until they gleamed, leopard and wolf pelts draped across shoulders, and the wings, those famous wings, wooden frames bearing eagle and ostrich feathers that rose above each rider's head like the pinions of avenging angels. The wings were not merely decorative. They created a terrifying whistling roar when the hussars charged at full gallop. That sound, combined with the visual spectacle of 3,000 armored riders emerging from dust clouds, had broken enemy morale before lances ever touched flesh. Today, that sound would echo across history. At 11 in the morning, the infantry began descending the mountain slopes, while they engaged Ottoman skirmishers in the vineyards and orchards below Kahlenberg. Fighting spread across the lower terrain as German and Austrian units pushed toward the Ottoman flanks. The battle developed slowly through the midday hours. Attack and counterattack. Ground gained and lost. The Ottomans fought stubbornly, their discipline holding against determined pressure. But their attention focused on the infantry engagement. They did not watch the ridgeline above. They did not see 30,000 cavalry assembling in formation. They did not hear the prayers being whispered in Polish. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, King Jan Sobieski raised his saber. Sunlight caught the blade. 3,000 hussars saw that flash of steel and tightened their grips on 18-foot lances. Behind them, another 15,000 German and Austrian cavalry formed into supporting waves. Sobieski spoke no grand speech. The time for words had passed. He simply pointed his saber toward the Ottoman camp and spurred his horse forward. The hussars began at a walk, then a trot, then a canter. The rhythm built like a drumbeat accelerating toward crescendo. 18,000 horses moved as one, their hoofbeats merging into a continuous rolling thunder that shook the earth itself. From the walls of Vienna, the defenders saw something they would remember until their dying breaths. A wave of steel and feathers cresting the ridge, the afternoon sun catching armor and lance points until the entire hillside seemed to burn with light. The wings creating that unearthly whistling shriek as air rushed through thousands of feathers. At an avalanche of men and horses pouring down the slope with the inevitability of a natural disaster. The largest cavalry charge in recorded history descended upon the Ottoman flank. Kara Mustafa heard the thunder first. He emerged from his tent and saw his death approaching at 30 miles per hour. The Sipahi cavalry, the finest horsemen of the Ottoman Empire, wheeled to intercept. These were not raw recruits. They had conquered kingdoms. They had never faced the Winged Hussars at full charge. The collision lasted 4 minutes. Polish lances punched through Ottoman armor like needles through cloth. Horses screamed and fell. Men died in the saddle without time to raise their weapons. The Hussars did not slow when their lances shattered. They drew sabers and kept cutting. They did not stop for wounded comrades. They did not pause to celebrate kills. They simply kept riding forward. The Sipahi formation disintegrated. Veterans who had never retreated suddenly discovered what panic felt like. They turned to flee and collided with the units behind them. Confusion spread faster than any sword could travel. Within 30 minutes, the Ottoman army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. 80,000 men became 80,000 individuals running for their lives. The Janissaries, elite infantry who had sworn oaths to die before retreating, formed desperate defensive squares. The Hussars rode them down without slowing. Artillery crews abandoned their cannons. Supply officers left fortunes in gold and silk. Commanders threw away their standards to avoid identification. Kara Mustafa fled with his personal guard, leaving behind his treasure at his pavilion, and every dream of conquest. By sunset, the plain below Vienna lay covered with Ottoman dead. 15,000 bodies, countless thousands more wounded, captured, or scattered across the Hungarian countryside. The siege equipment that had pounded Vienna for 2 months sat abandoned, already being stripped by Allied soldiers. The city that was supposed to fall had survived. Night had fallen when King Jan Sobieski rode through Vienna's gates. The streets told the story of survival. Rubble from collapsed buildings, barricades constructed from furniture and debris, the stench of death and disease hanging over everything. And lining both sides of every lane, the people who had endured. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck, gaunt faces, hollow eyes, all bodies reduced to frameworks of bone barely wrapped in skin. Children who had forgotten what a full meal felt like, elderly who had given their rations to the young, soldiers who had fought 60 days on failing strength, and they wept. They fell to their knees as the Hussars passed. They reached out to touch the horses, the armor, the boots of men who had ridden 500 miles to save strangers. Women threw flowers they had somehow found amid the devastation. Men shouted blessings in German, Polish, Latin, whatever words their cracking voices could form. Jan Sobieski dismounted at the Cathedral of St. Stephen. The building had survived the bombardment, though its walls bore scars. Candles flickered in the darkness inside. The altar still stood. Sobieski removed his helmet, walked to the front of the cathedral and knelt. He remained there for several minutes in silent prayer. Then he rose and spoke the words that would echo through centuries. Veni, vidi, Deus vicit. I came. I saw. God conquered. Not Poland conquered. Not Jan Sobieski conquered. Not the Alliance conquered. God conquered. Because the king understood something that smaller men often forget. Human courage is not self-generated. Human strength fails when tested beyond certain limits. What had happened that day exceeded any reasonable expectation of military success. 27,000 had routed 80,000. An empire that had seemed invincible lay broken on Hungarian soil. That did not happen through human effort alone. History rarely provides clean endings. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse after Vienna. It endured another 2 centuries, though never again threatening the heart of Europe. The alliance that had saved Christendom fractured within months. Old rivalries reasserting themselves once the immediate danger passed. Jan Sobieski returned to Poland and spent his remaining years struggling with the same political dysfunction that had nearly doomed the continent. Kara Mustafa paid for his failure with his life. The Sultan sent silk strangling cords to his defeated vizier, the traditional Ottoman method of executing high officials without shedding blood. But something had changed. The Siege of Vienna marked the moment when Ottoman expansion reached its permanent high-water mark. The tide that had risen for 3 centuries finally began to recede. Future generations would point to September 12, 1683, as the day the balance shifted. More importantly, and the battle demonstrated something about human nature that transcends any particular era or conflict. 27,000 men from nations that had spent a century slaughtering each other chose to stand together against a common threat. They set aside grievances that seemed insurmountable. They subordinated ego to survival. They recognized that some things matter more than the petty disputes that consume ordinary politics. Jan Sobieski did not ride south because it was safe or profitable or politically advantageous. He rode south because people were dying and he had the power to help. He brought his sons into battle because he believed some lessons can only be taught through example. He gave credit to God because he understood that virtue, not victory, defines a man's character. The Winged Hussars charged down Kahlenberg Mountain knowing many would not survive. They charged anyway, because some things are worth dying for. Because duty fulfilled matters more than years accumulated. Because the only defeat that truly destroys a man is the defeat of never trying. On September 12, 1683, the thunder of hooves echoed across history. It still echoes today. In every moment when ordinary people choose courage over comfort, in every decision to help strangers despite the cost, in every refusal to surrender to overwhelming odds. The Hussars remind us that darkness can be defeated, but only if someone is willing to charge. End